The Marlins, they look like the team will be, well, slightly cheaper, but potentially slightly worse. Craig Goldstein joins us from Baseball Prospectus to dig into his preview of the Miami Marlins. This is Locked On Marlins.
You are Locked On Marlins, your daily podcast on the Miami Marlins. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings from England and welcome to Locked On Marlins. It's your daily Marlins podcast. I'm your host, of course, Peter Pratt. Hit me up on X at Miami Marlins _UK. If you are listening to the pod, firstly, hello and greetings and welcome to Wednesday's episode. This is your team every day, and thanks for making Locked On Marlins your first listen of the day. Don't forget, guys, there is a YouTube channel. Hit subscribe over there on the YouTube channel as well. It is also called Locked On Marlins, so easy to find, easy to subscribe. Easy to get in on the comments too, so make sure you are in on the comments. A lot of action going down there as we build up to opening day. And delighted to welcome in first-time guest, Craig Goldstein in the house from Baseball Prospectus. Craig, how are we doing?
I'm doing really well, Peter. Thanks for having me.
For sure. This is going to be a fun one. There was a Marlins preview that you were behind, and yes. I think it is... firstly, a stunning summary of the Marlins. And so I think it's perfect for us to really get into it because, listen, there's a lot of bias that exists in this podcast. Rightly so. You know, I'm a Marlins fan and I'm not afraid to shout it, no doubt. And so there's often a lot of bias that is in this show. So it's sometimes good to have a conversation with someone that's maybe more neutral on the situation and maybe balance me. My regular guest, and people, the everydayers will know this, and the listeners will know, my everyday or weekly guest, Sean Barrett, he definitely balances me, but he's still a Marlins fan. So, Craig, I think you'll help to kind of add a slightly different perspective here on this one. So, really looking forward to this conversation for sure. Before we get into it, this episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. You can go to PrizePicks.com/LockedOnMLB. and use the code, all lowercase, Locked On MLB for a first deposit match up to $100. All right, guys, for those that have the rundown, fundamentally, we're starting with the end of the article. Listen, got to check this article out. Get to Baseball Prospectus and go and check it out. Craig's put it out there 2 days ago. It's there for your viewing pleasure. If you are a subscriber, of course, hit subscribe and get into that content. The end of the article, I'm not going to give it all away because someone needs to go and see some of it, but the end of it, I think, summarized it pretty well. The Marlins are cheaper. It's one of the topics we've talked about on this show. Their payroll is projected to be lower than it was the start of last year, right? Even though like some of the guys have got more expensive. But the projections are potentially that they're going to be slightly worse too. So slightly cheaper, slightly worse. But from your perspective here, Craig, as you've kind of dug into the Marlins, how have you ended up at this situation? How have you come to this conclusion that the Marlins, I mean, the cheaper is easy. That's easy to understand. But why have they gotten worse in your opinion?
Yeah, I don't want anyone listening to this. Obviously, people are listening to this are Marlins fans. They've heard this all, right? And it's easy to be defensive or prickly. And, sometimes it's like, we know, right? We get it. Mm-hmm. But I am writing this for a national audience, right, who isn't always plugged into the Marlins. But the way that we do these previews is we take our depth charts, which is how we allot the playing time to various players and their projections and put them together in these color-coded kind of bar charts. And you just end up running down position by position. And Patrick Dubuque, who creates our visuals, one of our editors, does a great job of color coding, not just each individual player's contributions over their time, but also at the end of the block is a big block, and he color codes that where it ranks relative to the rest of the league, essentially, on a red to green scale. Green is good, red is bad. And there's just not a ton of green. There's not none of it though, right? Like you'll see it. Luis Ariz at second base. Obviously, there's a lot of projected warp there. He's projected to perform very, very well. Jazz Chisholm actually projects quite well for us. And then the pitching, there's not a lot of deep green, but there's still a lot of green overall. Yeah. There aren't any real weak spots in the rotation, and that's without Sandy Alcantara. So the way I got to slightly cheaper or slightly worse, some of that is it's a callback to a tweet of mine people have liked a lot, but it's also that just having gone through, I wrote the intro and the conclusion last, honestly, because I wanted to go through each position. I wanted to look at the players, the projections, what they did last year, and get a sense of the team as deep as I possibly could, and then say, like, how are we going to frame this? And that last little line, some of that was just kind of a knowing nod to something I've said before, but it's also true of a ton of teams. It's just extremely true of the Marlins right now, in that we're projecting them to be an 80 and 82 win team. That's our projection right now.
Yeah.
Obviously they were a bit better than that last year and they made the playoffs, but the slightly worse part, to finally answer your question, is they let Jorge Soler walk out the door. And this was an offense that was bottom 5 in runs scored in the league last year, and they just haven't done much to backfill it. And when I say they haven't done much of anything at all on the major league level, right? Like there are a lot of minor league signings, NRIs, things like that, and that's well and good. That's Peter Bendix was the big news of the offseason. But ideally, you don't want the GM to be the big news. You want him to make the big news. And so, they finally signed Tim Anderson. That was their first major league signing of the offseason, and it was February 24th. I just, there are still guys out there, to their credit, but they haven't backfilled that offensive hole. And power is one of the real struggles with this roster. We'll see if Josh Bell and Jake Berger answer it as they did post deadline last year, but they've both been very streaky hitters before. So that's kind of where the concern is for me.
Yeah, for sure. From afar as well, what was your take on the fact that obviously, Kim Ang, she isn't with the organization. The Marlins actually wanted her to stay, but she declined her option, part of that. And so, leaves the organization because effectively, hey, we're going to bring in a president of baseball ops, right? So Kim Ang gone, Peter Bendix in. So from afar, what's your take on the front office moves, I would say? And how do you think that sets the Marlins up kind of like mid to long term, I guess?
Yeah, it's certainly interesting. And I think there are a lot of varied reactions to it, as it kind of happened. I think it's largely a really crummy spot to put Kim Ang in. Right. In that, they made a big deal when they brought her on as general manager, as the first woman general manager in the sports history, one of the first, Asian general managers alongside Farhan Zaidi. So you have, they made a big deal about that. And then they didn't give her a ton of tools to work with, right? They had the Jeter departure, the note that he kind of wanted to increase spending, but ownership didn't want to. Now they went out and she still was able to sign people. So that's to ownership's credit. But obviously the budget in general is not particularly large. I'm often very critical of small budgets. There are reasons for this team not spending like the Dodgers and the Yankees of the world, right? Like we can both understand that they're not going to go to that level right now, without changing circumstances. But they could also probably punch a little bit, higher than they have been. With Bendix, this is no shot at Peter Bendix. I think he's really smart and really good. I think he's a good hire, in a vacuum. But what it says, the between the lines thing is like, we want to succeed without that budget, right? We want to succeed without that, because that's what he's been a part of an organization that has done it. Now, pursuing success is a good thing, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But I'm going back and forth here. The counterbalance is Kim Ng just made the playoffs. There's a little bit fluky. There's a little bit of a down year in the NL. The Marlins were outscored on the season, that kind of stuff. It happens, but it doesn't bode well for the future, which is also part of why our projection is a little bit a little bit of regression. But they've basically let their GM go each of the last time, or force them out in some capacity, each of the last 2 times they've made the playoffs. And they've only made the playoffs twice in the last, I put this at the top of the the preview, but like they've made the playoffs in 2 of the last 4 years. And I said, just don't for any reason look beyond 4 years, because I didn't count it up, but it's 20 years, something like that. So yeah, I mean, it's a tough look, and it's also a tough look, just culturally speaking, because the prior GM who made it, Michael Hill, was also a black GM, of which there are very few, right? So it's like they finally, and often with minority managers, GMs, things like this, they are hired in places where it's a very dire circumstance, and then not really given the tools to succeed. And when the club is on the verge of something better, they are often replaced, right? Like we saw this, you can go to Rick Renteria, Lloyd McClendon forever ago, but Rick Renteria more recently, with both the White Sox and the Cubs, situations like that. So yeah, I mean, it's a tough look.
Yeah. I think you've called out some of the cultural elements around this as well, right? And you're hitting on it as well. The fact the Marlins have made the postseason twice in 4 years, and both times the GM or equivalent role has gone after that situation, which is kind of crazy. We're going to hit the first ad, and when we come back, I want to dig a little bit deeper on the strengths and weaknesses from your perspective of this roster. You've kind of teased a few out, Luis Arias, Jazz Chisholm Jr., but I want to really dig into it a little bit more deeper. See where the strength of this organization is, where the weaknesses are, and equally, there's still time to opening day. Can the Marlins backfill some of these weaknesses before we get there? But before we do that, this episode is brought to you by our good friends over at PrizePicks, and we got the sexy graphics up as well. Yes, sir. Love them. And PrizePicks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS. It's just you against the numbers instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks. We don't want to be playing against those sharks. And you pick more or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. Football season may be over, but the action on the floor is heating up. Whether it's tournament season or the fight for playoff home court, there's no shortage of high-stakes basketball moments this time of the year. Get in on the excitement with PrizePicks, America's #1 fantasy sports app, where you can turn your hoops knowledge into serious cash. And you can now win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000 with NBA, NHL, and college basketball entries today on PrizePicks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. So what have you got to do? Pretty simple. Here's what you need to do. Download the app today and use the code, this is all lowercase, LOCKEDONMLB, for a first deposit match of up to $100. Reminder, download the app today, use the code LOCKEDONMLB, and you get that first deposit match up to $100. All right, guys, back here with me, Peter Pratt, and Craig Goldstein. We are digging into the Marlins and the Marlins view, or well, Baseball Prospectus's view of the Marlins, and Craig specifically. Craig, you've teased it out already. This is a color-coded situation, so those digging into the article will have the color coding to help. But from your perspective, let's start with the strengths of this roster. When you're kind of digging into it, you've kind of teased them out like Luis Arias, Jazz. But when you kind of look at this roster as a whole, where are the bright spots here right now beyond those two guys? If there are any beyond Luis Arias and Jazz Chisholm Jr.
Yeah, I think the pitching. So our color coding says it's kind of in the middle of the pack in terms of projected WARP, but which is our wins above replacement metric. But with Jesus Luzardo, Braxton Garrett, Yuri Perez, and Edward Cabrera, you have just an incredible starting 4. The problem for the Marlins is mostly we basically don't project any pitchers to make every single start. Very, very few of them do because of the way that baseball is trending. And so once you get past Trevor Rogers, maybe Max Meyer coming back from injury, once you get past those 2 in the 5th starter slot, this is where the Sandy Alcantara injury really hurts. And it's because he knocks everyone back a slot, right? But you start getting into Ryan Weathers, Sixto Sanchez, if he's ever healthy, right? Those guys do not project particularly well. And beyond that, it's kind of a smattering of openers and guys like that who we have projected to take up the starting slots. And the bullpen, where it is also pretty good, from my view, I think an underrated part of this team. I think they've done a really good job over the last several years. And this goes back to when Gary Denbo has been on board from the Yankees, and what the Yankees do. They kind of churn out these hard throwing relievers. The Marlins have done that pretty successfully. We even saw them trade Steven Okert, right, for Nick Gordon. And like, again, like that's just part of, they had more guys than they needed, especially left-handers, which I thought was interesting. They potentially have 5 lefties in that bullpen, which is a little bit weird. Again, the bullpen projects kind of in the yellow range, kind of middling. I think they can overperform that pretty well. Tanner Scott projects extremely well. AJ Puck, we'll see. I saw that they might be starting him, or grooming him to start. I'm a little skeptical on that, given his history, but we'll see. That would certainly add depth. You slot him ahead of Ryan Weathers as an option, and that's probably better than having Weathers as your go-to backup. But they a number of these guys, JT Chagua, Brian Hoeing, not necessarily household names. Again, for people listening to this podcast, they are, but not otherwise. But really quite effective. And we saw again what they've done with Tanner Scott, Andrew Nardi. These guys are pretty good guys. So I think I'm not breaking new ground by saying the pitching is the strength, but I do think that's where it's going to happen for this team if it's going to happen.
Yeah, no doubt. They've made some. Let's flick to what I would describe as developmental areas, or areas where they've tried to enhance in their own way that were weaknesses before. So maybe let's segue into those. For me, going into this offseason, I would say the Marlins were heavily prioritizing a shortstop upgrade. So let's start there. Tim Anderson is now in. You already mentioned, the first and only major league free agent thus far the Marlins have signed. There's still time, by the way, and everyone listening, we know there's still time. JD Martinez still out there, by the way. But Tim Anderson in, how does that move the needle for the Marlins in your perspective at shortstop?
So it's a really interesting one, and it's really like one of the biggest question marks about this team, and I think honestly about just Anderson as a player. We saw basically the floor fall out beneath him last year. He's had multiple leg injuries, and he's someone who has really relied on his legs to outperform. Right, our metric, deserved runs created plus, has never loved him, but it has kind of grudgingly acknowledged his quality, right? Like his OPS plus has always kind of outpaced his DRC plus, because DRC is trying to find a different thing than just what happened, but it's how much success the player kind of contributed to versus the defense, the pitcher, that kind of stuff. But it's never loved Tim, in part because he doesn't hit for a ton of power. It's a lot of singles or speed doubles kind of stuff. He hits the ball hard, but especially last year, he put it on the ground over 60% of the time, and he just can't. Again, maybe early in his career, he could have survived with his speed. But if he's not fully healthy, he's older, his legs just aren't going to support that. And he's always hit the ball on the ground a lot. But if you look at his metrics, the underlying ones, exit velocity, launch angle, 90th percentile exit velocity, he compares pretty favorably to, or basically is a dead-on replication of Cody Bellinger as one example, who obviously, you look at the difference between their contracts, right? Even though Bellinger didn't get the deal he wanted, he's making 6 times what Anderson is this year. But they have basically, and I'm talking about like less than a mile per hour difference, the same max exit velocity, the same 90th percentile, the same 80th percentile, and the same average exit velocity. The difference is Cody Bellinger put the ball in the air and Tim Anderson didn't. Their Cody Bellinger's launch angle, I think, was about 17 degrees on average. Tim Anderson's was 2. So
oh no!
Again, you put Tim Anderson on a team who's developmentally teaches that pull side lift approach to get more power. He's never going to be a power hitter, maybe especially in the park that he's in with this is not a great fit for that. But if you could get him just lifting the ball, even if he's spraying it or if he's, pulling it to the power alleys, he could really put his legs to use. And he hits the ball hard enough to have that success. Now, you could also say it's maybe damning of Cody Bellinger and a reason not to buy into his his comeback season as much as you might want to, but it's probably somewhere in the middle, right? That there is legitimate hope for Anderson to come back, and there's there's probably, reason Bellinger isn't going to do what he did last year.
Yeah, love that. The Bellinger comp. We're going to talk about catching spot as well, because the Marlins have tried to do something at catcher. Well, no, that's unfair. They have done something at catcher. They've taken Stallings away and they've added in Bethancourt. So we'll talk about that shortly. I'm also really intrigued to get your sense about the outfield group around Jazz. And I'm talking about Brian De La Cruz, Jesus Sanchez, Avisel Garcia, and these guys. So we'll do that shortly. But before we do that, it's time to let you know about our good friends over at eBay Motors. And guys, this is my favorite ad of all of them. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, because peak performance needs roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. All right, guys, back here with me, Peter Pratt, and Craig Goldstein on Wednesday, the 6th of March. We have talked a lot of Marlins, obviously, but we talked about the Tim Anderson impact. For me, if he can get the ball in the air, we should be very excited. Let's talk about the catching spot, Craig. The Marlins have added Christian Bethancourt, replacing Jacob Stallings. Jacob Stallings was absolutely putrid in 2023, but what can Bethancourt add to this group to make it better?
It's tough. I mean, I'm not really convinced he's very good. So he's got a great arm, right? I mean, that's the biggest. He was briefly kind of a two-way guy. It was before they really took two-way anything pretty seriously. But the Padres would pitch him, in blowouts and things like that, and he can throw quite hard. Obviously, with the way the rules have changed around the running game and encouraging the running game, that is going to be valuable. He can stymie the running game. He can throw guys out. He can deter guys from trying to run. I think that's going to be pretty valuable. The catching situation in general is I would say pretty bleak. I didn't mind the Stallings acquisition at the time. It just did not go very well. I don't think that was necessarily a bad play. It just, sometimes they don't work out. I think Bethancourt is again, like, projected offensively, not particularly good. Of course, the guy he's replacing is in the same boat. So I don't think there's going to be too much of a change there. And I expect Nick Fortes to really be more of the primary guy.
Agreed. I like Nick Fortes defensively in particular. So, I think he should be the primary guy. But if he can get Bethancourt's arm or somehow improving that,
they need to Fortes graft him. They need to graft the two of them together. Yeah, Fortes, for our metrics, was quite valuable framing. He was in the top half of the league as a framer, but actually gave back some value in the running game in terms of throwing. So, again, they're each good at kind of different things. Bethancourt was not a bad framer, but not quite as good as Fortes is in that regard.
All right, let's transition over to the corner outfield spots. There is a guy. I want to start here. There is a guy that is the most topical conversation within Marlins Twitter, within this show, within the comments, you name it. This guy has been slandered for multiple years, and rightly so. I want to know from you, Craig, how red is Avisel Garcia's projection bar for 2024? And should he be on the roster, in your opinion, your unbiased opinion?
It's the brightest red. Honestly, it is, which is the worst that you can do. It's the most vibrant red you can have. He's not quite in the situation what we call the long reds, which is the guys who both are extremely bad and projected to get a ton of playing time. Okay. We do project him to get the most at designated hitter, but also you're going to see Jake Berger there, probably some Josh Bell, some. Yeah. Ideally, you'll see a free agent there a little bit. That would be my hope for this team. Nice. And so in terms of whether he should be on the roster, I would cut bait. I understand that there are reasons not to for a team whose budget is where the Marlins is and what they're trying to do, just cutting the roster spot and adding someone else, taking 12 million or whatever it might be. I think it's around that in dead money, is hard to swallow for this team. And there are, there's a theme on this team in terms of the guys and how they haven't succeeded, not just that they haven't succeeded, but how. And that is that Avisail Garcia needs to lift the ball. He hits the ball quite hard still, but he hits it into the ground. And again, he was fast, right? When you go back to his early days in Detroit, it was like he was, they called him like mini Miguel Cabrera in terms of how their bodies looked the same, except he could run. He could really run for his size, especially. He can't do that anymore. And if he's not lifting the ball, the fielders are going to get it. And they're going to, that's how he makes outs on the infield. And even when he gets it through the infield, it's a single. So you need extra base hits from him. And if you go look at the last time he was successful before this contract in Milwaukee, he was hitting more fly balls than he was, than he has been in Miami. So again, that is a theme. You can extend that theme to Jesus Sanchez. You can extend that theme to a degree to Brian De La Cruz.
Mm-hmm.
De La Cruz doesn't hit the ball quite as hard. Jesus Sanchez hammers the ball.
Yeah,
absolutely hammers it. And I saw him at a Futures game performance, put 2 in the upper deck in a batting practice. I think he hit 2 home runs in that Futures game. It was when it was in DC. He can really just absolutely smash it. But he needs to lift more often. I mean, he needs to access that power more often. And that's just a theme with this club. And my hope is that what Peter Bendix can bring to this team is you can't do it all at once. You're not going to change everyone all at once. But we've seen what Tampa Bay has done, even with guys, and this might fit the De La Cruz model a little bit more, who don't hit the ball as hard. It is that pull side lift approach. Isaac Paredes. I mean, you put Jesus Sanchez and Isaac Paredes' numbers next to each other in terms of exit velocity, 90th percentile exit velocity, things like that. You're going to think Jesus Sanchez is 3 times as good as Isaac Paredes. But Isaac Paredes is optimized to pull the ball down the line to the shortest distance for the wall and hit the ball in the air a lot. And it's just a numbers game at that point, right? Yeah. A number of those are going to go over the fence, even though his exit velocity is pretty middling. And they're already doing it again with Jose Caballero, who is, again, not a power hitter. But it's like, let's get the most out of the power that you have. And so that's where, again, you go back to a number of the guys on the Marlins team right now, that if they can start to do that, you're going to see different results. The question is, we don't know if they will.
That is the question. One thing, what we do know is that, Peter Bendix and all of his new brains are in the organization. They've got a new batting coach as well in some ways. So there's been a few changes there, and, we'll see how that translates for certain. And let's just think about.
I don't want to interrupt. The other thing on the manager front and kind of the brain trust and that kind of thing is I would add is like Skip Schumacher is extremely highly regarded, right? Yeah. So you've got a really good person in place at the team level, on field level, in terms of obviously he was not the lift and pull type of player, but he's really well regarded from basically everyone I've talked to in terms of his ability to connect with players and understand the game as it is now. So that if you're looking for optimism between the new front office, even though he's a holdover, I would just say, like, it doesn't seem to me like there's a problem on that front.
Yeah, for sure. One final one, then we'll get out of here. Just, we've talked about the DH spot. We've talked about Avisail Garcia, that from your perspective, you're projecting a decent chunk of playing time and, not that productive at that point. You've also shared you're expecting, this team to be 80 and 82. How big of a difference do you think like a JD Martinez could be for the Marlins for that DH spot? Just, giving them that extra boost, I'd say, offensively.
Yeah, I think really significant. And it's hard to get people to grasp, like when Cody Bellinger re-signed with the Cubs, I think he moved a win for us because they actually are a pretty deep team. And so the guys he was replacing, even though we project him for around 2 wins, it was only a 1-win improvement. And I mean that in terms of WARP. One WARP doesn't always connect to 1 win on the projection for the simulated season. But in this case, it did. For the Marlins case, you're replacing a guy who we're projecting for 45% of the time at DH, but he's also getting time in the outfield, in right field. So he's accruing a number of at-bats and producing negative WARP with someone who should, and again, DHs usually don't move the needle a ton because they don't accrue defensive value, that kind of stuff. But JD Martinez, even Brandon Belt, someone like that who's going to bring in a 1 to 2 to a little more than 2 wins above replacement, taking a guy who's getting negative playing time spot is going to be significant. And as you said, they're 80 and 82 in our projection. They can obviously outperform that. They did last year. You're right on the fringe of the playoffs right there. You can go to the playoffs in back-to-back years, and it's not going to take a lot of investment. And that's the part that's killed me. That when I dug into this team and when I decided to do the intro and conclusion at the end was, why aren't they being more active? Because obviously the answer is budget. But if there was a time to use the budget, it's now. You've got, I mentioned Max Meyer really briefly, but that's another arm at, ready to contribute this year at your stable. You've got Sandy Alcantara for several years, with his extension. Yuri Perez is at the major league level right now, earning the lowest he's ever going to earn. You know what I mean? And so now is actually the time, because in the future, you're going to have to make your trade-offs of trying to extend Yuri Perez, of what you're going to do with Jesus Luzardo. We know he was potentially on the other teams were asking for him. Let's say I don't want to say he's on the block, but other teams are asking for him. He's going to be expensive. He's had an injury history. When is the time, right? So to me, now is the time to make that investment. Well, you're right there, and there's really only 2 to 3 really good teams in the National League. Yeah, because you can put yourself in the mix with everyone else
for sure. Final one. I always do this, but final one. What's more likely in your opinion? The Marlins win 75 or they win 85?
That's such a good. Look, I don't want to be a downer, but
there you go. You know where you are.
I'm gonna go with 75. I try and be. Look, I'm an honest guy. I don't want to upset anyone. I don't think 85 is out of the question remotely. But again, you talk about one of the things I noted with this pitching staff, and it is a very good the rotation specifically is a very good rotation in my opinion, with a lot more upside than our projection set. The projection doesn't deny the upside, but it's not the 50th percentile outcome.
Yep.
And I think there's a lot of upside there. But to a man, Jesus Luzardo, Braxton Garrett, Yuri Perez, and Edward Cabrera threw the most innings in the majors that they'd ever thrown, all last year.
Yeah.
We know how pitching can disappear today. We saw it. Lucas Giolito is hurt today. Justin Verlander's not starting the year on time necessarily. Sonny Gray has a hamstring injury. All this stuff, right? All these guys just threw the most innings they've ever thrown in a single season at the major league level. It's a lot to ask for that twice in a row. It is the way I look at it. And again, you go back to, maybe AJ Puck slides in, but the depth on the pitching side, once you get past 1 or 2 guys, is pretty thin. And that's the part that worries me.
Yeah, makes sense. Seems fair. We're out of time, but I think that's been a wonderful conversation. I'm sure that the listeners will agree to that. Craig, please let everyone know where they can follow along. Where you're posting your work, what's going on in your world at this point before we get out of here.
Sure. Social media. I am on Twitter. I still call it Twitter. At CD Goldstein. You can follow me there. I post, I try and post all of our articles every day. I'm also on Blue Sky at cdgoldstein.baseballprospectus.com if you're on that. And really just baseballprospectus.com is where you're going to find my work, a bunch of other really talented, smart thinkers, we did our lead article today is financial analysis of the Braves, fourth quarter report, because they're a public company now, to roster breakdowns. We're doing previews every single day. We have projections, we have fantasy analysis, all of that kind of stuff. It is a subscription site. If there's an article you want to read, if it's this one, drop me a line. I'm very, rarely opposed to putting something in front of the paywall if people want to see it and take advantage of it. So please just let me know. I'm happy to do it for you. Whether it's this one or one in the future. We try and, we're not really trying to exclude anyone. We just need to exist as a site.
Seems fair. It feels like there's a promo code brewing here, like a Locked On Marlins promo code of some sort. But anyway,
hey, it's possible.
we've had enough of those for this episode. Craig, firstly or lastly, in some ways, thank you for the time, for coming on, and equally the article itself. I've read the full version. I don't want to go blow for blow and give it all away. I want people to go and read it themselves. But I must say, really on the money is how I would describe it. I think it's a really fair assessment of the Marlins, and I'm completely in lockstep with you where they're right there. Just
right there.
a little finessing of this roster, but there's still time and there's still free agents out there that get me excited. And so I hope this roster isn't done. And I think just a little bit more. And then we could be talking about an over 500 club, I think, headed into 24. Guys, thanks for making Locked On Marlins your first listen. We will be back, of course, tomorrow because, listen, it's a daily podcast. Look forward to seeing you guys then. Make sure you check out the article that Craig has been behind, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys real soon.